Hey, do you have Quakers in your ancestry? Well, I do, and so I was so excited when I found out that I was going to get this interview because we're going to learn all about Quaker records here in just a moment. But before we get started, let me introduce myself. My name is Connie Knox. I am a lifelong genealogist here to help you go further, faster, and factually with your family research. Now, don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel and ring the bell so that you get notified each time we upload a video. If you like what you see, please give us a thumbs up. And leave us some comments below. Now, don't forget that we have newsletters. Sign up for the newsletter and the Facebook page. Make sure you're hooked up with both of those. Also, I'd like to, now welcome you to Footnotes. Now, footnotes, if you've not seen a footnotes episode before, I call them footnotes because it's in the footnotes where the real sources are. And well, today's real source is Beth Saunders, and she is a staff member at Guilford College in Greensboro, North Carolina, and that is where they have a Quaker library. She has a ton of knowledge to share with us about researching your Quaker ancestors. I'd also like to add she has an online bookstore for rare and out-of-print and used books. It's called tannerybooks.com. You can find her there as well. Also, because of the number of links that we're going to be sharing with you today, I will try and put all of them in the show notes below, but if you sign up for the newsletter, there will also be a full set of notes that you can download once you sign up. Now, for those who are already on the newsletter, I will put it in the next edition of the newsletter as well, so you can just click and download that resource as well. So, starting now, sharing her knowledge with us about Quaker records is Beth Saunders. Well, welcome to Genealogy TV. I am so glad you're here, and I have to tell you, I am pumped about this one because I have Quakers in my family, and so I am super excited to be talking about Quaker research today. So let's get started with the basics. If someone is just, let me rewind just one second. When I was a teenager, my grandmother said, "You have Quakers in your history." And at that age, I was like 12 or 15, I forget, somewhere in there. And I didn't even know what a Quaker was, It was a guy on a cereal box, right? So I ignored it for a long time because I didn't know what it meant. And so I regret that. And then so like a decade later, I finally started doing some digging and went, oh, Quakers have great records. Yes. I should have done this. So help those who are just getting started, at least the basics, and then we'll dig into the little more in depth a little bit down the road here, but tell us the basics.
Quakers are still around. We don't wear black and white. We're not Amish. So we get all kinds of confusion sometimes when people come in doing research for their families about that some people don't think Quakers still exist, and they definitely do. But way back in England, everybody didn't have birth certificates, right? So, and then the Quakers were kind of rebels against the established church. So they had to keep their own records, and especially since they didn't believe in priests or paid clergy. They considered everyone a minister. So they had to have really excellent records because the rest of the world would claim that, oh, you didn't really get married because you didn't have an Anglican priest there, or you're not in our Church of England record books. So that's when they started keeping the really good records. And the different kinds of records are births, marriages, and deaths. And then they kept minutes of their meetings. Generally, they would have monthly meetings for business, and sometimes separate men's and women's, kind of depends on the era and the meeting. And these are really good records for when people ask permission to join, when they move somewhere new. So it's a great resource for genealogists.
These records began about what time?
Well, in North Carolina, they began in 1680. So that's, that's really early. In England, they began when Quakers began.
Okay. All right. I find them fascinating because the level of detail that are in those records everything from maybe someone not treating somebody else appropriately, and so they've had a little squabble about it, or somebody not going to church often enough. And boy, we could talk about cemeteries. There's all kinds of stuff to talk about. But I know that one of the things that's important is dates. So let's talk about dates right off the top, because the dates are a little different than what we see today.
Right. Thanks for bringing that up. The Quakers didn't like that all of the months and days of the week were named after pagan deities. So, and they sort of espoused simple in their lives and in a lot of different things. So they called it first month, second month, third month, and so on. And then first day of the week. Sunday was first day, Monday's second day, and so on. So you'll see that when you run into the records.
So I also came across some great resources that help explain that a little bit more, and how the dates changed back in the mid 1700s. I think it was like 1750s.
Right. And that is a great thing to know, because as soon as you start doing research in Quaker genealogy, we recommend that you write things down exactly as you found them. So if it says somebody was born on first month, second day, you want to write it down that way. Now, the dates changed. Prior to the 1750s, the year started in March. I believe it was March 25th.
Right.
So it always starts in the spring. So when you're looking at those old dates, then I like to just add 2 to think about the years the way we think of them now, so that March, or subtract 2 if you're talking about the old time, subtract 2 so that March would be first month. And when you run across 8th month, that's October. And actually, if you know the sort of origins, oct means 8, sept means 7. So December, DEC stands for 10. So that kind of helps you remember too, because that's the way the months used to be.
That is a great trick. Now, if I remember, I was doing a little homework to refresh my memory. I believe it was January 1st, 1753 is when they began with January being the first month and moving forward after that. But I also know, and maybe you can help me remember this, but I recall there being, some of the dates were written like, gosh, I can't remember, it was 51/52 or 52/53, so that, because as they were going through that conversion of dates, they were trying to make it clear as to what date they were talking about, but I find it even more confusing.
Right.
I don't know if you can reflect on that at all.
Sure, that's a great point. First off, I hate to say that it started on a certain day, because, and by the way, the rest of England and plus the Catholic world changed dates a lot earlier. The Quakers everybody used to start their year in March for hundreds of years. But then the Pope and then the Church of England changed to this new start in January thing. And the Quakers said, no, we're not having any of it. So they were just the last to change.
I did not know that.
Yeah. So 1750s, I think of that in a general way. If you're around that era, like I said, you want to write it down exactly as you found it. And I think you were looking at an epistle from London, some guidance about changing it that was like 1751. I like to think about it because of my own family research around 1753, 1754. So if you're right on those days, what you want to do is look in the minutes of that meeting, and they'll probably say when they changed it.
Okay.
As word got around. But it generally 1750s, after, before, you safely know where you are.
Well, I'm glad you cleared that up for me, because I have always wanted to know. So thank you.
And then I want to talk about, you talked about the slashes.
Oh, yeah.
When I first started doing research, if I found something that said 1732/33, or probably the 40s or whenever you got closer to it, I thought that meant they weren't sure that somebody was born about that time. Well, it doesn't. It means old style / new style, because especially over here in America, they were hanging around with all these other people that didn't use quite the same year as the Quakers did. So they started saying old style, the way we keep our records, / new style, the way the rest of the world keeps their records, so that people would understand.
I am so glad you said that, because I have seen that in many records, and I was always confused.
I know that's another, sorry, I just want to mention, you're only going to run into that / in the winter, because that's when the years weren't the same as the rest of the world. If you're in the summer, you may be 2 months different, but you're going to be in the same year.
Good point again. Well, okay, so that's huge. I mean, really, because I've done a lot of research in the Quaker records, and we'll talk about abbreviations in a minute. But I know that that stuff's a little bit easier to learn. But to me, the dates thing has always been kind of confusing. So let's talk about Mr. Henshaw's encyclopedias.
Yeah, isn't that a great resource?
Look what I have.
Yay.
I have a very old copy. Here, I'll pull it up so everybody can see it. This one happens to be North Carolina. This is volume 1. But explain about these awesome resources.
Right. They've been awesome resources since like late 1920s, early 1930s, right?
Yeah, I think this one says it was a publication date of 38.
Yes.
This one happens to be a 1978 reprint from the Genealogical Publishing Company.
Right.
36, excuse me.
By the way, if you get a really early one, or well, actually it doesn't matter, but yours I'm sure has a supplement, because right after Henshaw published this Encyclopedia Volume 1, they found some records in, I think it was Perquimans or Pasquotank County. So if you're on like in the page 90s and you say 90A, 90B, they just kind of added all those in. So it was really great to still discover more old records in the 20th century.
Well, and I feel very fortunate to have this. This was given to me by a woman in Hillsborough who is a relative who was very deep into the Quaker research for Henleys, which my maiden name is Henley, so there's a ton of Quakers in the North Carolina area for that. Anyway, you were going to say about the Henshaw books.
So what it is William Wade Henshaw published the Encyclopedia of American Quaker Genealogy, and it is extracts from the monthly meeting minutes and record books. He didn't do it all by himself. He had a lot of librarians helping him. And the first volume that came out, we're really interested in this area. It's the greater North Carolina area. It's meetings that were part of North Carolina yearly meeting, and that included some in South Carolina, Georgia, and Tennessee. So he pulled all these great genealogical extracts, and it's not the entire record. It's the stuff that a genealogist would care about: who was born, who moved from one place to another, and who got disowned.
All right, now before you go on, explain disowned for those who are not familiar with being disowned or what that could mean.
Okay, so the Quakers got into their way of living, and especially into the 1700s and the 1800s, they got strict about who could be a member. And if you didn't live according to their ways, they would disown you. Now, it's not like we think some of the fiction and other denominations of shunning or anything like that. People could still come to meeting for worship if they were disowned. And it doesn't necessarily mean that their whole family was disowned. But one thing I really wanted to point out is, there's some abbreviations in the front of the book. And there's a lot of good subtleties to those abbreviations. For example, DIS, disowned, means they were no longer considered a member of the Friends. And so they would stop keeping records on that person. We get a lot of queries that say, I want to prove that my Quaker ancestor fought in the Revolutionary War. And the standard answer is you could find out if they were disowned, but they're not going to keep records on him after that when he was fighting. But there's another abbreviation, I think it's CON, it's short for condemned.
Yes.
Condemned means that they apologized. They condemned their own actions, and the way he put it in here, the ones that he pulled out, usually means that they got to stay a Quaker. So they're going to still be in the records because they were forgiven.
Yes. And I'm going to try and put those abbreviations in a document. A lot of the information I can usually put in the show notes below, but sometimes when I have too much information, I will put basically sign up for the newsletter, and I'll send you this document. And I'll also put it in my newsletter for those who are already on the list. So there will be a document available for that. So check out the links below for that.
One thing that just comes to mind is if somebody is received on certificate from a certain meeting,
that's right,
or received on certificate, then they are probably a friend already that moved from another place. If somebody is received by request, there might not be a previous record because they might have just joined friends at that moment.
Okay. So one of the other things just so that everybody has an understanding, and you clearly can help me straighten out my partial education on this. When someone was getting ready to move, they had to request a certificate, right, to leave the church, and then they would give that certificate at the new church. Is that right?
And it would mean that they were a member in good standing, so they had a good reputation, and when they showed up at the new place. Another thing that I'm glad you asked, because I almost forgot to mention, is that as people were pushing westward in North Carolina, more meetings were opening. So there are a lot of cases where somebody transferred their membership and didn't move. It means that, for example, Cane Creek in Alamance County was the farthest west they were for a long time. So then when people started getting membership in New Garden and Springfield and things in Guilford and Randolph counties, they might not have moved. Cane Creek might have been the nearest one they had for a long time, and they just finally put their membership at this new meeting. Now we have Quaker records on Ancestry, and I work part-time, I think you mentioned, in the Quaker archives at Guilford College. We get a lot of genealogical researchers in, but the questions that they have changed. We used to get people coming in that wanted the basics and hadn't seen Henshaw before and wanted to know, where do I start with my Quaker ancestry? Now they come in, they say, I found this Quaker record on Ancestry. What does it mean? Where do I find out why were they disowned, and all that kind of stuff. But I do want to mention the indexing. One of the first things we show people when they come in still, and I don't have a copy to show you, but it is the comprehensive index to Henshaw. And basically that means the first 6 volumes that he published from different states. But that index is just as thick as volume 1, and it has first and last names, and it is a great resource. It is not online because it was just published in 1999, but it's good when you're going between volumes, like when people move from Pennsylvania to North Carolina. And then after William Wade Hinshaw, another man kept doing, Willard Heiss, published several volumes of abstracts of Indiana. And I wanted to mention that the blue book, the index to the first 6 volumes, is really, I think, just as good as the indexing on Ancestry still. It's a great resource to start with, especially when you're flipping from book to book or when somebody's moving from meeting to meeting. However, the Indiana books, they have a whole separate index. It's only surnames. So if you're researching Quakers in Indiana, you might want to start with Ancestry because the indexing for that has really improved your situation.
Oh, nice. I did not know that. Now, I did, as I was putting this stuff together for the document that I'm going to share with everybody, I did outline all 6 volumes and the index, so all of the links for all of that will be in the show notes as well.
Okay, so as I told you, the people coming in have different questions, and they've usually searched on Ancestry, put the person's name in, popped up with this record, and there's no context for it. Or they've found an extract. Usually if you're on Ancestry and you're looking in the Quaker records and you get something that's typed, it's an extract from Henshaw. If you get that old handwriting, then it's from one of the actual record or minute books. So one of the things I teach people when they come into the archives and they've already seen some things on Ancestry is not only the abbreviations, but each meeting in here, and it'll be hard to hold up the show, each meeting has 3 sections. One is like the history of that monthly meeting. And as genealogists, we kind of gloss over and skip that part. The second is the records, which is the family tree stuff that he pulled from various books, births, deaths, or whatever, however that meeting kept it. And the third is the minutes. So as you go through the meeting, if you had the actual book in your hand, you might look at the index and then page through and see these different parts. But what I show people, if they find out that somebody is disowned and they want to know why, is you could look for that book on Ancestry, but also go to that first little section that everybody ignores about each meeting. I'm just going to pull one, for example, New Garden.
You talking about the section about the history?
Yes. It's usually like 1 or 2 pages at the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
That says when it started. And when it started actually becomes kind of important. But if you turn to the very end of that part, the last paragraph will tell you what primary resources exist for that meeting and where all the records in the other sections come from. So, for example, New Garden says that birth, death, and marriage records are in 2 volumes, and it's Roman numeral 1 and Roman numeral 2 in these other pages. The men's minutes are from 1754 to 1888, and the women's minutes from 1790 to 1878. The women's minutes prior to 1790 were destroyed when the house of Prudence Williams was laid waste by fire.
Wow.
So that helps you to know what exists and what you can get to as far as your original record. And if you want to, we can go look on Ancestry and see what one looks like.
All right.
Go up to Search Card Catalog.
This is one of my favorite tricks.
And then the keyword, hit Quaker. Now what I do is I sort of scan down the page to the one that has over 6 million records.
Or you could sort by record count.
Yeah.
And there it is.
There it is.
All right.
So say we want to look for somebody in New Garden. Go over to the state in North Carolina. And then the county will be Guilford. And then, of course, the meeting will be New Garden. New Garden monthly meeting. And there's the books.
Well, now this is a whole lot better, especially when we're, okay, so backing up just a minute, if we think about our research question, we write down, okay, we think someone was in New Garden at this time, then we could specify exactly what we're looking for if we know this person's between these years, right?
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Well, especially if you're looking for a disownment and you've seen the typed extract, so you know the date already.
Ah.
So you want to go, and it was a man, you want to go to the men's minutes of that date. And then you can just flip through the pages online.
Well, let's just jump over there and take a look.
Yeah. And you can always type down at the bottom to skip a bunch of pages. And that helps you when you're needing to skip 20 years.
Interesting. Well, I just love this old handwriting too. It's so much fun to read.
So those are the actual minutes.
Isn't that cool?
The extracts, yeah.
So does this have, oh, this does show information in here as well.
Mm-hmm. And that is,
in this case, it's only one person, but.
Yeah. And that varies, I'm afraid. People all around the country did this indexing. So some are indexed very well, some not so well, some were harder to read.
And if you find something, you can always save it to a person in your tree
Right.
or download it. I've done that many times.
One thing I want to point out is when people go to a page like this, they might not know where it came from. So if you look up at the top of the page, because if you're searching on a name, it's going to take you directly here, right?
Yeah.
Go up to the top of the page and you'll see what book it's from. And once in a while, I'm afraid there are some metadata or label errors. If it doesn't quite match, like you're looking for a vital record and it says up at the top that you're in the men's minutes, sometimes they scanned an entire microfilm reel. And you're going to want to maybe use that film strip at the bottom to go back and see what's on the beginning of that microfilm, or where's the beginning of your actual book. And that's going to help you cite your sources.
Exactly. That's exactly where I was going next. So one of the things you can also do is what I like to do, even though it might say that we are on, page, I'm making this up, 18. I always like to note that the image number is image number 10, and I always go back to the beginning and to the front matter of this section and take note of everything that you see here as well.
Exactly.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. I love this stuff.
And when somebody was disowned, usually they'd be complained of 1 month and a committee would go out and investigate and maybe they'd try to get in contact with them. So there might be several entries there that you want to read to find out what's going on with your ancestor.
Yes, because they always, it seems like on all the records that I've read, there's always, it's kind of like problem and resolution. So there's a problem or a complaint stated, and then there's a resolution, or there's a marriage announcement and a resolution as to whether it's okay for them to marry. Or, seems like there's always two parts to a lot of what was happening in these records. So great stuff, great stuff.
4 major American repositories of Quaker records made an agreement with Ancestry. So you have Guilford College, which is basically all the Quaker records for the Southeast, Earlham in Indiana, and Haverford and Swarthmore in Pennsylvania. So those are online with Ancestry now. Any of the older records, the genealogists would be interested in. For privacy, of course, we keep the modern minutes off of there.
Uh-huh.
But a couple that are missing that don't have an agreement with Ancestry right now, as far as I know, are some New England area Quakers. They work with a historical society, I think, on Nantucket. And so those, I don't think those are online at all. And then Ohio, we had a lot of people migrate from North Carolina through Ohio and not just Indiana. And those records are not online.
Okay, well, that's really good to know for folks who are researching in those areas too. Let's talk for a minute about meetings, because I don't know that we clearly explained that. The differences between, we have men's and women's meetings, we have monthly meetings, yearly meetings, I think there's quarterly meetings even.
Yes. So,
what is there for genealogists? And it's my understanding the monthly meetings are the best for genealogists, but help me out.
I agree. I think the monthly meetings are the best for genealogists. So basically, Quakers, or especially early Quakers, didn't want to call their building a church. So they thought the people were the church, and they could meet anywhere. They met in homes or whatever, and they usually started in homes, especially for new meetings. So when they became established, they would meet together for business matters once a month. So they started calling it, with their simple language, like the months, they started calling it a monthly meeting. Generally, it's one official meeting or church, and several meetings that wanted to meet together before yearly meeting. By the way, our yearly meeting is sort of a state thing. It can be a large region. London is basically sort of the all of England yearly meeting. So it depends on your region.
Is there a quarterly meeting?
Yeah. I wanted to say that sometimes, especially when they were new, there might be 2 meetings in a monthly meeting. So Marlboro and I think Plainfield Friends, I'm not sure, for a long time they were one monthly meeting together. But generally it's one established meeting or church. And all of the big region met once a year. That's yearly meeting. That was sort of the top dog organization. And people wanted to meet more often than that, especially when they lived a little closer. So that became the quarterly meeting. So meeting every 3 months together, that would be several monthly meetings together. I hope I haven't confused that. But you're right. I think most of the genealogical information is on the monthly meeting level. Quarterly meetings, they're good for when you don't have monthly meeting information. You want to see if somebody was mentioned, but basically people sent their representatives. So it's not going to be all encompassing as far as the membership.
I know one of the things that I discovered as I was reading through some of the Quakers in Randolph County that I've studied quite a bit was it was kind of interesting because if somebody wanted to get married, apparently the men's meeting notes would say that we're sending Joe or somebody over to meet with the groom and I guess the family. I don't know. Explain that.
Okay. So when somebody wanted to get married, they would announce it in front of their people. And instead of, say, the non-Quakers were out there publishing the banns or getting a marriage bond, the Quakers would announce it to their people, and that gave everybody a chance to say if they thought somebody was already engaged to somebody else, or if there's just a general problem. There were problems sometimes when somebody wanted to marry a first cousin and the meeting didn't like that. But usually there was no problem, but they would announce it at a couple of different meetings for worship, like on a Sunday morning, and they would come to the business meeting and officially announce it. And they might have to go to her meeting and his meeting and announce it there. And they would form a committee and go make sure none of these problems were happening, you know.
Right. They were in good standing in the community.
Right. And that's the men's meeting usually would consider the man, and the women's meeting would consider the woman. And that's one thing to point out maybe in Henshaw is all the minutes are together. Henshaw pulled out men's and women's and put them by surname. So if you have one that's the man, about the man, and he's approved and it's on the same date as one about the woman, that's probably one from the men's meeting and one from the women's meeting.
Interesting. Because I know that I found several references, the announcement that they were going to get married and let's form a committee and go check on these people. And then they would report back. That was in the meeting minutes as well. They've reported back and everything's cool, you know, and they recommend everything's fine, I think is kind of what I recall reading.
The dates, sometimes people think that the date that was approved is their marriage date, but they would probably get married between that one and the next monthly meeting.
So were they truly monthly meetings, or did these folks go to church every week? Like, you know,
it's monthly for business matters, which was approving things and transfers and things like that. It's weekly or twice a week for worship.
Okay.
So here are some little more in-depth tips. And one is that I use a version of this book at work at the archives all the time. Stephen Weeks's book, and it's like Henshaw. Our nickname is just the guy's last name, so I call it Weeks, you know. But it's Southern Quakers in Slavery. And I wouldn't think as a genealogist to go to that. And I have to admit that I haven't read a lot of these books that I recommend to people. I've used, like a genealogist, I've gone to indices and just looked up certain things. But it is a great resource for genealogists because in the back there are these tables of monthly meetings. He published it in, I think, 1899 or 1898. So this is as of his time. And these are just a couple of pages are the actual monthly meetings, what county they were in, when they started. But the great resource that I don't know of anywhere else is that after a couple of pages, they have what's called particular or indulged meetings. So these were the unofficial meetings, either that didn't make it or that became a meeting later and they were just getting started. So the great resource for records for genealogy is if you see a wedding record or something and it mentions their meeting and you've never heard of that meeting, you can't find anything on it, it might be one of these unofficial little meetings, and the table says who they reported to. So, for example, I come from Archdale Monthly Meeting, which is now established, but I think in here, I don't know if it was Bush Hill or what, but it was under Springfield.
So it had like a parent meeting.
Yes. Mm-hmm. They all branched off from somewhere else. So it's, if you want to look up the records for somebody in the 19th century that is a modern family from Archdale, then this would give you a clue to go to Springfield's records.
I know a lot of times these folks were wanting to establish a meeting because it was too hard to get to the meetings because it was either too far, or in the wintertime there was too much snow to get through, or
Mm-hmm. And Springfield is a whole 2 miles away.
I've read in some of the meeting minutes too that sometimes folks were getting in trouble for not showing up to the monthly meetings. And I remember reading one of the excerpts that when they investigated as to why this person wasn't showing up, it was because the bridge had been washed out in one of the recent storms and he couldn't get there. And they're like, so I just thought it was interesting. So it's my understanding that book, and I'm going to try and share this, that book that you just showed us, is this the same book?
Yes, and the chart is down on what, page 331, way down near the end, but it's before some index and appendix things.
So this book is available on Google Books, and I will put a link for that in the show notes as well.
Okay. And I wanted to show you one thing I don't think is in the Google Books is a map. We actually have this framed in the archives, but Stephen Weeks, and I don't want to unfold it because it's fragile, but it shows where the meetings are as of his time, including extinct meetings. They're a different color. So that's a nice little reference of where things are around the state.
Are there reprints of that book?
Might be.
I'll have to dig around. If there is a reprint, I'll put it in the show notes too, because I'll find it.
I think the map is on the Library of Congress website. So maybe if
the map that's in the back of that book.
Yeah, the actual color map. I think they have a scan of it there.
Now I know what you're talking about when you mention the map. Let's talk about the Quakers and the Civil War, because I know that the Quakers did not believe in fighting. So how on earth did they get through that era without getting, in trouble with the rest of the community for not fighting for or against slavery?
Some of them did get in trouble. Some of them got arrested and tortured, and it was a really rough time for everybody. We at Guilford, we have this resource on our library guide called the Underground Railroad, and interest in that has just exploded lately. So there's not only some basic stuff if people are just mildly interested in it, but my supervisor, the archivist, has written a teacher's guide to the Underground Railroad that you can use in the classroom. There are also some primary sources that we have online. In addition to the Quaker Monthly Meeting records, we have manuscript collections. So some of them are actual letters that people wrote back and forth during that time, including, it's Henshaw's papers, I think, including a man who went all over the state and up to Richmond, Virginia, trying to free young Quakers who had been arrested for not wanting to fight.
Well, how involved were the Quakers in the Underground Railroad?
It really varied. So, for example, my family, I can't say personally that anybody was involved. They didn't own slaves, but they just generally were really busy with their farms and weren't necessarily activists. But then you had some Quakers, like the Coffin family, who actively smuggled runaway slaves to the Midwest. And there's a place in Guilford County called Mendenhall Home Place, and one of the original false bottom wagons is there that you can see where slaves hid in, and then they put straw on top of the false bottom. They say there's only 2 in the country, and there's one that you can go see there.
Wow. Well, next time I'm in the area, I'm going to check that out.
Okay, so sometimes people get beyond the dates. You know, somebody was born, somebody died, and maybe you want to know what your ancestor's life was like. We're starting to get more queries like that too. So Quakers wrote. They wrote lots and lots of books. And we have modern books like you were talking about. I don't think I have Back Creek. Yeah, we do. We have Back Creek right here. So we have modern books that people have written that are more about the meetings, and not just names, but about life and what went on in those times. And we have really old books, because even back in the colonial days, there were these traveling ministers. Since they didn't have preachers at the early Quaker meetings, and some still don't today, these traveling ministers would go around and encourage them and check on them and pray with them. And they kept journals. They were really great about keeping journals. So this one, for example, is Job Scott. And there was this traveling minister from England named Catherine Peyton. And I wish I had the quote written down, but she writes about visiting all these little meetings in South Carolina, North Carolina. And she gets to Eastern North Carolina and she says, "It's no wonder all these people are sick. They don't put their whiskey in their water." Because in England, she kind of needed to drink the water.
Oh, that's hilarious.
Yeah, it's
So cool. Go ahead.
sorry. And then this isn't so much North Carolina, but there's a lot of good stuff. And I've done my family research some in South Carolina. There's the Annals of Newberry, which is not a Quaker book, but it has a lot of Quakers in it. And he talks about what they wore and how this one lady stood up and said the same thing every time. And he mentions a lot of names, and it's good, but it's kind of funny too. And
That's hilarious.
this is another one. This is based on writings in the 1700s by an Anglican minister who traveled around the wilderness of South Carolina. And he wrote about some of the Quakers too, but he's just really scathing on how backwards all the pioneers were and how the women ran around barefoot, and not necessarily Quakers, but just all kinds of things. And he's hilarious too.
Let's talk about migration patterns, because I know that some of my Quakers moved from North Carolina. I think they went through Indiana, but I haven't proven it yet. And they ended up in Kansas.
I'm
out there.
Not as much of an expert on the migration patterns. I mean, I know that people left here, but they went all different places. Indiana, Ohio was one of the original places that you're going to find their records when they were moving, but they might have gone on beyond those places, kind of like here when they had their membership at Cane Creek, but they really lived farther west. They had to establish something first before the records start. But yeah, there was because of slavery before the Civil War, and then because of sort of poverty and hard times after the Civil War, and hearing about good, rich land in the Midwest, people were just leaving in droves, which was hard on a lot of meetings don't exist anymore. But we actually had help from Baltimore Yearly Meeting. They sent people down to teach farming methods and start schools and really encourage Quakers to stay in North Carolina.
Okay, so if we go back in time, people that are immigrating into the United States, was there any reason why Quakers would be coming to the United States? Do you have any understanding of the history back then, coming from England? Right? It was England, right?
Well, mine came from Ireland, but before that from England.
Okay.
I think they moved from England to get land, probably. Some of them, because Quakerism was just starting, and some of them were actually Cromwellian soldiers, and they had been given land for their service, but the land was in Ireland. And that's sort of my little family path. But then with different kings and queens and regimes, things got harder and harder on any, they called them dissenters. If you weren't with the Church of England, you were a dissenter. And so some Quakers moved to America for religious freedom and new opportunities. There was also a famine in the 1730s and 40s in Ireland that is not the one that everybody knows about. It was actually called the Little Ice Age. And so I think some of my family ran into that, and they moved here, where America, I think, to create some boundaries between the population centers and the Indians that they were having trouble with, encouraged people to migrate here and gave them land for coming if they would settle in the unpopulated areas of, say, the Carolinas.
We were going to talk about African American genealogy as it relates to Quakers. I know there's not a lot there, but is there anything?
We have a very small resource online that I probably need to go in and edit, because so much more has opened up in the last couple of years. Let me back up. The people will call us with questions about, do you have list of the slaves that Quakers helped? Well, the Underground Railroad, it was illegal to help the slaves, and so they didn't write this stuff down usually because they didn't want to get persecuted and caught. So we have very few actual records like that. And actually, it got to where it was illegal to free your own slaves in North Carolina. The laws got really bad. So for a while, people didn't agree on the different things to do. Some wanted to send them to Africa, Liberia. Some wanted to send them to the Midwest and to Canada. Some wanted to keep them here because some of them wanted to stay here and they wanted them to have a say. So the ones that wanted to stay here, North Carolina Yearly Meeting as an entity owned them. Since people couldn't free their slaves, they'd give them to the Yearly Meeting and they would take care of them.
Well, that's interesting.
But we, as far as I know, don't have records of those names. That's one of the reasons people will ask us.
Right.
But now the records for slaves, unfortunately and sadly, they were considered property. They are in the civil records. So these exchanges, including giving them to the Yearly Meeting, will be in the county records, not the Quaker records. And those are getting more and more online.
Well, that is a huge tip. For anybody doing research there. And I would also like to point out, be mindful of border changes on the county. So if you're looking in what you think is one county, pay attention to when the borders change, because it might have been the neighboring county. So just another heads up. All right, tell me about the Quaker Cemetery site.
So I think we launched that late last year, and it's not some comprehensive, you can go there and look up a name. Basically, we're at the archives, we're still getting in records all the time. Some are less interesting, like, committee meeting minutes, things of the yearly meeting. Well, there was this cemetery committee of the North Carolina Yearly Meeting that met for many, many years, and sometimes they were more active, sometimes less active. But North Carolina Yearly Meeting owned the deserted cemeteries, shall we say, especially where people migrated away and they left a cemetery behind. And sometimes the Yearly Meeting didn't own it, but might be interested in it. Who does own it? We want to know who has the deed. So we got these committee minutes or files, and I looked through them and said, this is some good stuff. So it's not like a book, but it's the research that they've done through the years on who owns what's going on with it, and what historic meeting it was. So I put that together with some published books and just whatever records I could find, and created a list of Quaker cemeteries. And by that, I mean in the greater North Carolina area, those that were historically connected to North Carolina Yearly Meeting.
Okay, so that's specific to North Carolina, then doesn't go beyond the borders of North Carolina.
No, and it includes the South Carolina and those really the greater North Carolina Yearly Meeting area.
And where do people find this site?
So that's on the Quaker Archive site. You've got a spot that you can go to Quaker Records or the Quaker Cemeteries. So I just wanted people to know that that's not going to be comprehensive. There might be just a mention of a cemetery and we don't know much about it, or there might be a link to find a grave and somebody has done the entire list of everybody there. Also on that site is a list of current past meetings and what records we have. So for example, if you go to, that there's been some divisions among Quakers, just like a lot of churches. So example, if you go to Friends Church of North Carolina and you look up a meeting that has been around for a really long time, then it'll say that we have their records from 1754 to 2018 or whatever exists.
Maybe we should talk about that a little bit, because I know that the Quaker Church was divided at one point. Do you know the history offhand of the division?
Yeah, so it's happened all over the country in different ways, and I'm not as familiar in some regions, of course. It was a big breakup in Pennsylvania in I think the early 1800s. And as a matter of fact, in maybe the 20th century, some of them got back together. And then for North Carolina, we withstood that big 1800s hullabaloo that was happening in Pennsylvania and the greater American Quaker world. But then we got to these awful things like music in worship and paid pastors and, just some things that other traditional Quakers didn't agree with. So we branched off into 2 yearly meetings in, I think, around 1906 or sometime in the early 1900s. And so one was called North Carolina Yearly Meeting Conservative, and one was called North Carolina Yearly Meeting, but it was associated with Friends United Meeting that you'll see in old records as the 5 years meeting. And
okay. Is this the Hicksite? I forget the names.
That is the Pennsylvania terms, but it's sort of related, and there's different branches.
Do you recall what those names are?
Well, there's the Hicksite Gurneyite was the big one in Pennsylvania, and then I think there were Wilburites that kind of influenced people. And so we actually there's a poster that shows all these different branches and breaking off.
When it comes to websites, so this is associated with Guilford College,
right?
That you work for, correct?
Yes. It's Quaker Records there on the left on your menu bar there. Okay, now here's where on the left you can see the different yearly meetings that exist kind of now. And then on the right there, you can go to the cemetery site or the Quaker Genealogy site.
We talked about Quaker cemeteries, and there's more information here. Is this the site you were referring to?
You are on the Quaker Cemetery site.
Wonderful. And I will put a link for that in the show notes again, but that's library.guilford.edu/Quaker Records is where I'm at right now. I found this little page fascinating because it really helps talk about the dates and the early dates. And I just, as soon as you see an old page, it kind of catches your eye, right? Well, I really thank you for giving us all this information. If somebody wants to find you, how do they do that?
Okay, well, I'm not all in one place, but I'm the genealogies and things I do is at genealolegacy.com, and that's getting started. And then I have a bookshop with old and rare books at tannerybooks.com.
And I was playing around on the Tannery Books website and I was having a great time. In fact, I'll share that right now. Here, you have some really great books. So you have an online historic book site. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. There's a Stephen Weeks right there.
Looky there. Wow. Yeah, of course, those of us who just oogle about all of this really cool stuff. And you know, look at these old books. Oh my goodness. Wow. I don't know where you find this stuff.
I'm a book magnet, so I have to sell some.
Yeah, I hear you. Well, I truly appreciate the time and the education. I find this stuff so much fun. Quaker research is a blast because God bless the Quakers for keeping such great records, and as a result, a deep history, family history, and so I'm very grateful.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Well, that was great stuff. Thank you, Beth, so much for the interview and sharing all your information with us. Don't forget, she has a bookstore at tannerybooks.com. And well, do you have Quakers in your background? Tell us about it in the comment sections below, and tell us where your Quakers are from. Maybe throw some surnames in there to tell us what Quaker surnames you have and the states that you're researching in. All right, so don't forget, there are links in the show notes below. Sign up for the newsletter so that you can get the full download of all the show notes and all the links associated with it. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so that you get notified each time we upload a video. Also, if you liked it, please give us a thumbs up. And until next time, keep on climbing your family tree.